3 weeks after our divorce, my ex-husband looked me straight in the eye across a crowded restaurant and whispered, "Look at you. Pathetic." Then his mistress laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not an awkward laugh. The kind of laugh that comes from someone who thinks they've won. For a second, I just stood there holding a tray with 2 iced teas and a basket of rolls. The Friday night dinner rush buzzed around me. Plates clattered. Country music played softly through the speakers. Families filled nearly every table inside Riverside Grill in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. But all I could hear was Brittany laughing. I swallowed hard and forced a smile. "Can I get you folks anything else?" Gary leaned back in his chair. "Oh, I'm sure we'll think of something." I nodded and walked away before either of them could see the tears threatening to form. Or at least I hoped they couldn't. My name is Linda Matthews. I was 48 years old that October, and I'd been divorced for exactly 23 days. Not that I was counting. Okay, maybe I was. After 23 years of marriage, it's hard not to count. I headed into the kitchen and set down the tray beside the drink station. "You okay?" asked Travis, one of the cooks. "Fine." "You don't look fine." I grabbed 2 fresh glasses. "Just tired." He gave me a look that said he didn't believe me. Nobody at Riverside Grill knew the whole story. They knew I'd gotten divorced. They knew my husband had left me. Small-town Iowa wasn't exactly famous for keeping secrets. But they didn't know everything. They didn't know that Gary Matthews had left me for a woman 21 years younger. They didn't know I'd spent more than 2 decades helping him build a life that he eventually walked away from. And they definitely didn't know that he'd chosen tonight to parade his new girlfriend through the restaurant where I worked. On purpose. Because Gary never did anything by accident. I returned to the dining room and found Brittany scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up. "Can I get another lemon for my water?" "Of course." "And extra napkins." "Sure." "And ranch dressing." "You haven't ordered yet." "I know, I just want ranch." Gary chuckled. I turned and walked away. A year earlier, I would have argued. I would have told him to stop encouraging childish behavior. I would have reminded him that being kind cost nothing. But that version of me was gone. The divorce had burned away a lot of things. Around 7:30, the crowd thickened. The Friday fish special was popular as always. Local retirees filled their favorite booths. Families stopped in after high school football games. Couples celebrated birthdays and anniversaries. The familiar routine usually comforted me. Tonight it felt different. Every time I looked toward table 12, Gary was watching. Sometimes he smirked. Sometimes he whispered something to Brittany. Then they both laughed. I tried focusing on my other customers. Mr. and Mrs. Donnelly needed coffee refills. A family of 6 wanted extra barbecue sauce. Someone needed a check. Someone needed a to-go box. Normal things. Safe things. But my mind kept drifting. 23 years. That's how long Gary and I had been together. We met when I was 23. He worked at a hardware store. I worked at a dental office. Neither of us had much money. We built everything slowly. Or at least I thought we did. A house. A family. A future. Then last spring I found messages on his phone. At first he denied everything. Then he admitted part of it. Then more. Then enough. The rest happened exactly the way people always describe but never expect. Lawyers. Arguments. Paperwork. Silence. I lost a husband. My son lost the family he'd always known. And Gary gained Brittany. At 8 o'clock, they finally ordered dinner. Brittany studied the menu dramatically. "What's the difference between the ribeye and the New York strip?" I explained. She asked 6 more questions. Then ordered chicken. I almost laughed. Almost. As I wrote down the order, Gary looked around the restaurant. "Busy tonight." "It usually is on Fridays." "Good." I waited. He smiled. "I'd hate for people to miss seeing how well you're doing." There it was. The reason he'd come. Not dinner. Not the food. An audience. I felt my stomach tighten. But I kept my voice calm. "Anything else?" "No," he said. "We're enjoying ourselves." Back in the kitchen, I leaned against a stainless steel counter. Just for a second. My hands were shaking. I hated that they were shaking. The divorce had already taken enough from me. I didn't want him taking my dignity, too. A few minutes later, my manager Karen walked over. Karen was 63 and had been managing restaurants longer than I'd been married. She studied me carefully. "Table 12 bothering you?" I hesitated. "A little." "Need me to take over?" Part of me wanted to say yes. Part of me wanted to walk out the back door and drive home. Instead, I shook my head. "I can handle it." Karen squeezed my shoulder. "I know you can." When their food arrived, I served it without incident. For 10 blessed minutes they were too busy eating to talk. I almost started relaxing. Then Gary called me back over. I approached the table. "Everything okay?" He dabbed his mouth with a napkin. "Actually, yes." "Glad to hear it." Then he looked up. Really looked at me. The way someone studies an old photograph. "You know," he said quietly, "you always thought you were better than everyone else." I stared at him. "I never thought that." "Sure you did." Brittany smiled into her wine glass. Gary continued. "And now look at you." I felt every muscle in my body go tight. Around us, conversations continued. Nobody else noticed. To everyone else, it probably looked like an ordinary exchange between a server and customer. Then Gary leaned closer. His voice dropped low enough that only I could hear. "You used to think you were too good for everyone." He paused. His eyes locked onto mine. "Now you're carrying plates." For a moment I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Couldn't even breathe properly. Then I forced a smile that felt like it belonged to somebody else. "Enjoy your dinner." I turned and walked away. But as I disappeared into the kitchen, I realized something that scared me more than his cruelty. For the first time all night, I wasn't sad anymore. I was angry. Really angry. And something told me the night wasn't finished yet. The strange thing about humiliation is that it doesn't always hit you all at once. Sometimes it comes in waves. The first wave had been seeing Gary and Brittany walk through the front door. The second came when he called me pathetic. But around 8:15 that night, a third wave rolled in. And this one almost knocked me over. I was carrying a tray of desserts to another table when Brittany snapped her fingers. Actually snapped her fingers. Like I was a dog. The sound made several customers glance over. I stopped and looked at her. "Yes." She pointed at her water glass. "I need more ice." I stared at the glass. It was still half full. "Of course." "And lemon." "You already have lemon." "I want fresh lemon." Gary grinned. I picked up the glass. "No problem." As I walked away, I heard Brittany say loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "I don't know how people do jobs like this all day." A few customers looked uncomfortable. Gary laughed. "Some people don't have a lot of options." That one landed exactly the way he intended. I disappeared into the kitchen before I said something I'd regret. Inside, Travis was plating orders. "You look like you're about to throw a chair." I filled the glass with fresh ice. "Not a chair." "That's encouraging." "A fork, maybe." He laughed. For the first time all evening I did too. Just a little. "There's the Linda I know." I shook my head. "She's been hiding." "We'll bring her back." I wished it were that simple. The truth was the divorce had changed me. Not just emotionally. Practically. Financially. Socially. In ways I never expected. When you're married for more than 20 years, people tend to see you as half of a pair. Gary and Linda. Linda and Gary. One unit. Then suddenly you're just Linda. And some people don't know what to do with that. Several couples we'd known for years quietly stopped calling. A few mutual friends chose sides. Church became awkward. Neighborhood gatherings became awkward. Everything became awkward. Even buying groceries at Hy-Vee sometimes felt like an endurance test. People stared. People whispered. People pretended not to stare. Honestly, I preferred the ones who just stared. At least that felt honest. Back in the dining room, Brittany was now taking photos of her meal. Several photos. From different angles. With different lighting. I walked by carrying another order. She stopped me. "Can you take one of us together?" I blinked. "Excuse me." "A picture." She held out her phone. "Please." The word sounded forced. Like she'd only added it because other people were watching. I accepted the phone. Gary slid his arm around her shoulders. The two of them smiled. I snapped the photo. Then another. Then another. "Perfect," Brittany said. As I handed back the phone, she looked at the screen and frowned. "Oh. What?" "You made me look older." For a second, I thought she was joking. She wasn't. A nearby customer actually choked on his coffee, trying not to laugh. I quickly walked away. Behind me, I heard the man mutter to his wife. The camera didn't do that. His wife nearly spit out her drink. That tiny moment shouldn't have mattered. But it helped. A reminder that not everyone in the room was buying what Brittany was selling. Around 8:30, the restaurant was packed. The waiting area near the entrance was full. Karen was helping seat customers. Servers rushed between tables. The kitchen printers kept spitting out tickets. Normally, the chaos energized me. Tonight, I felt exhausted. Gary and Brittany had now occupied their table for nearly 90 minutes. They weren't leaving. And every time I hoped they were finished, they found another reason to stay. Another appetizer. Another drink. Another refill. Another opportunity to make my life miserable. Then Brittany launched into a story about an upcoming vacation. Loudly. Very loudly. "We're staying at this amazing resort in Maui." Gary nodded. "The ocean view alone is worth it." Brittany smiled. "I told Gary I never want to stay anywhere less than 5 stars again." Gary laughed. "You get used to nice things." I happened to be refilling a nearby coffee cup. Neither of them looked at me, which somehow made it worse. The whole conversation felt staged, like they were actors performing for an audience, or maybe just for me. A few minutes later, Gary casually mentioned the lake house. The lake house. That one hurt. Not because I wanted it back, because I remembered helping pay for it. Years of savings, years of planning, years of sacrifice. I remembered painting the bedrooms myself, installing shelves, planting trees, building memories. Now he talked about it like I had never existed, like he'd created everything alone. I stepped into the service hallway behind the dining room and closed my eyes for a moment. Just a moment, because I could feel tears building again. And I hated crying at work. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning supplies. I took a deep breath. Then another. Then my phone buzzed. A text message. "Ethan, my son." I smiled immediately. That hadn't happened much lately. The message was simple. "Love you, Mom." Nothing else. No explanation. No reason. Just those 3 words. I stared at the screen, then typed back, "Love you too." A minute later, another message arrived. "Keep your chin up." I frowned. That was unusual. How did he know I was having a rough night? I started typing a response, then stopped. Maybe he was just being kind. Maybe mothers overthink everything. I slipped the phone back into my apron pocket. The message helped more than he probably realized. Around 8:40 things finally got worse. Much worse. Gary waved me over. I approached the table. "What can I get you?" He held up the dessert menu. "We're thinking about dessert." "Great. But before that..." He reached for the check folder sitting near the edge of the table. Then he smiled. That smile. The one I used to mistake for charm. "I have a question." I waited. "Do servers still split tips here?" I felt my stomach tighten. "Some of them, yes." "Interesting." His voice became louder. Not shouting. Just loud enough. The kind of volume people notice. "I don't want my money going to people who don't deserve it." The conversation at the nearest table stopped. Then another. Then another. Silence spread across the room like spilled water. Even Brittany looked uncomfortable. For the first time all night. A dozen eyes turned toward us. I could practically hear Karen moving somewhere behind me, ready to intervene. Gary leaned back in his chair, satisfied. He thought he'd won. He thought this was the lowest point of my life. What he didn't know was that the night was about to change. And it was going to change because of the one person neither of us expected to walk through that front door. The silence hung in the restaurant for what felt like forever. In reality, it was probably 3 or 4 seconds. But when you're standing in front of your ex-husband while half a dining room is staring at you, a few seconds can feel like an hour. Gary sat there looking pleased with himself. Brittany stared into her wine glass. I could see Karen starting toward us from the hostess stand. Then the front door opened. A burst of cool October air drifted inside. And everything changed. I didn't notice who had entered at first. I was too focused on not crying in front of 30 strangers. Then I heard a familiar voice. "Well, looks like we're still busy." My head turned. So did everyone else's. Standing near the entrance was Frank Dawson, the owner of Riverside Grill. Frank was 71 years old, broad-shouldered despite his age with silver hair, and the kind of face that always looked slightly amused. He'd owned the restaurant for decades. Most people in Cedar Rapids knew him. He wasn't there every night anymore, but he still stopped by often. Usually to check on things, talk with regular customers, and make sure nobody was ruining his restaurant. But Frank wasn't alone. Walking beside him was my son, Ethan. For a second, I genuinely thought I was imagining things. The last time we'd talked, he'd been working in Kansas City. He wasn't supposed to be back until Thanksgiving. Yet there he was, 6'2", brown jacket, same crooked smile he'd had since middle school, holding the door open behind Frank. My heart nearly stopped. "Ethan." His eyes found mine immediately. "Hey, Mom. I forgot about Gary. Forgot about Brittany. Forgot about the entire restaurant." I walked straight toward him, then practically threw my arms around him. He hugged me back. A real hug. The kind that makes you feel safe for a second. "What are you doing here?" I asked. He smiled. "Long story." I pulled back and looked at him. "You could have warned me." I wanted it to be a surprise. Normally I would have laughed, but something felt strange. Not bad. Just strange. Frank looked unusually cheerful. Ethan looked unusually nervous. And behind me I could feel Gary watching. I turned slightly. The moment I saw his face, my confusion deepened. He looked pale. Not angry. Not annoyed. Pale. The color had practically drained from his cheeks. I frowned. Why would Ethan's surprise visit bother him? Then I noticed something else. Gary wasn't looking at me. He wasn't even looking at Ethan. He was looking at Frank, like he'd just seen a ghost. Frank glanced toward table 12. His expression changed instantly. Oh, that single word carried a lot of meaning. Gary shifted in his seat. Brittany looked back and forth between them, clearly confused. Frank smiled politely. Gary! Gary forced a smile. Frank. Neither man sounded particularly happy. The entire exchange lasted maybe 2 seconds. But it felt important. Like there was a conversation happening underneath the conversation. One I didn't understand. Yet, Karen appeared beside me. Everything okay? Frank nodded. Perfectly fine. Then he turned toward Ethan. Well, Ethan laughed nervously. Right now. What are you talking about? I asked. Neither answered. Frank gestured toward the center of the dining room. Come on. I blinked. What? We need a table. At this point, several customers were openly watching. Nobody was pretending anymore. Small-town restaurants don't get much live entertainment. Frank and Ethan had somehow become the evening's main event. Karen quickly cleared a nearby booth. Frank sat down. Ethan remained standing, still looking nervous, still looking excited, and somehow still refusing to look directly at Gary. I walked over. Would somebody please tell me what's happening? Frank chuckled. Patience. I don't have patience. That's true. A few customers laughed, including me. Despite everything, I laughed. Then Frank checked his watch. Good timing. For what? I asked. Instead of answering, he looked at Ethan. Ethan, congratulations. The restaurant quieted again. Frank smiled broadly. Your paperwork is finally complete. Ethan let out a breath he'd apparently been holding for months. Thank God. Paperwork. What paperwork? I looked from one to the other. Neither seemed interested in explaining. Then I heard something. A glass clinked against a plate. I glanced toward Gary. His hand was shaking. Actually shaking. My confusion turned into curiosity. Now I knew something was wrong. Very wrong. The question was why? Brittany finally spoke. Gary. He didn't answer. She touched his arm. Gary. Still nothing. Frank noticed. His smile widened slightly. Not cruelly. More like someone watching a mystery finally solve itself. I walked closer to Ethan. What paperwork? He hesitated, then smiled. You'll know soon. That wasn't helpful. Try again. Trust me. I don't trust anyone who says trust me. Several nearby customers laughed. Even Ethan. For a moment the tension eased. Then Frank stood. The room seemed to straighten with him. Not because he was intimidating. Because people respected him. He'd spent decades helping local families. Hiring local kids. Supporting local charities. When Frank spoke, people listened. Including Gary. Especially Gary. Frank looked around the dining room. Then at me. Then at Ethan. Finally, his eyes settled on table 12. Interesting night. Nobody responded. Frank continued. You know, I've spent 40 years learning something about people. Gary stared at the table. Frank smiled. The ones who spend the most time trying to embarrass others usually end up embarrassing themselves. Now the restaurant was completely silent. Even the kitchen seemed quieter. Brittany looked confused. I felt confused. Only Gary appeared to understand where this conversation was heading, and he looked miserable. Frank walked slowly toward table 12. No hurry. No anger. Just calm confidence, the kind that comes from knowing facts are on your side. Gary swallowed. I actually saw him swallow. Brittany finally noticed. Okay, somebody tell me what's going on. Nobody answered her. Frank stopped beside the table. Then he looked directly at Gary. I didn't realize, he said pleasantly, that you still hadn't explained things. Gary's jaw tightened. Frank. No, I'm serious. Frank sounded genuinely amused. I assumed she'd know by now. Brittany frowned. Know what? Frank glanced toward her. Then back to Gary. The smile never left his face. Who actually owns half this restaurant? Everything stopped. Every conversation. Every movement. Every sound. For one long second, the entire dining room froze. Including me. Especially me. Because I had absolutely no idea what Frank was talking about. For a moment, I honestly wondered if Frank had lost his mind. I stared at him, then at Ethan, then back at Frank. The restaurant was so quiet I could hear dishes clinking in the kitchen. Finally, I found my voice. "What are you talking about?" Frank looked surprised. "You never told her—" Now he was looking at Ethan. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "I thought you did." "You thought I did?" The two of them exchanged a look. Meanwhile, I felt like the only person in the room who had missed the first 3 chapters of a book. Brittany stood up slightly in her seat. "Okay, seriously, what is happening?" Gary's face had gone from pale to almost gray. And suddenly I realized something. He wasn't worried about me. He wasn't worried about Brittany. He was worried about whatever Frank was about to say next. Frank pulled out a chair and sat down. Calm as ever. "Linda," he said, "how much did your father tell you before he passed?" The mention of my father hit me unexpectedly. My dad had died 7 years earlier. A heart attack. One ordinary Tuesday morning. One ordinary phone call. One ordinary day that split my life into before and after. I swallowed. "Not much about business." Frank nodded. "That explains it." I looked at Ethan. "Ethan," he gave me an apologetic smile. "Mom, please don't be mad. That sentence has never been followed by good news. Ever." Frank folded his hands. "Your father and I were partners." "I know that." "We started this restaurant together." "I know that too." "What I didn't know was where this conversation was going," Frank continued. "When your father passed away, his ownership stake didn't disappear." I frowned. "No. It transferred." My stomach tightened. "Transferred? To whom?" Then it hit me, slowly, like sunlight creeping across a room. "No." Frank smiled gently. "Yes." I sat down, because suddenly my knees felt unreliable. Around us, customers remained completely invested. Nobody cared about dessert anymore. Nobody cared about football scores. Everyone wanted answers, including me. Frank leaned back. "Your father left his shares to you." I stared at him. The words didn't fully register. "Left his shares to me. That's impossible." "It isn't." "I would have known." "You were grieving." He spoke kindly. "And honestly, your father expected we'd eventually sit down and discuss everything properly." I looked at Frank, then Ethan, then Gary. And that's when I noticed something important. Gary wasn't surprised. Not even a little. He already knew. The realization hit me like a truck. I slowly turned toward him. "You knew." His jaw tightened. Nobody answered. That was answer enough. My heart started pounding. "Gary." Still nothing. "You knew." Finally he spoke. "It wasn't important." Several customers actually laughed at that. Not because it was funny. Because it was ridiculous. Even Brittany looked stunned. "Not important," she repeated. Frank raised an eyebrow. "That's certainly one way to describe it." I felt anger rising inside me. Not the raw emotional anger from earlier. This was colder, sharper. The kind that comes from connecting pieces of a puzzle. Years of pieces. Years of conversations. Years of strange moments that suddenly made sense. Ethan finally stepped forward. "Mom, there's more." Of course there was. There always is. Frank nodded toward him. Ethan took a breath. "The paperwork I finished today involved Grandpa's shares." I blinked. "What paperwork?" "The trust." The trust. Another thing I'd barely understood after Dad died. Lawyers had mentioned it. Documents had appeared. Documents had disappeared. Back then I was overwhelmed. Trying to hold a marriage together. Trying to support my son. Trying to survive grief. Now I was beginning to realize how much I hadn't paid attention to. Ethan continued. "The trust transferred additional voting rights." The restaurant owner smiled. "And as of this afternoon, you and Ethan control a majority interest." The room exploded. Not literally, but people started whispering immediately. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Someone near the bar actually said, "Holy hell." Brittany looked like she'd forgotten how to blink. Then she slowly turned toward Gary. "You told me she was a waitress." That sentence hung in the air. Gary shifted uncomfortably. "She is." Frank laughed. "She's also one of the owners." The look on Brittany's face was priceless. For the first time all night, she wasn't confident. She wasn't superior. She wasn't smirking. She looked completely lost. And honestly, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then Frank dropped the next bomb. "Of course, that's only part of the story." Gary closed his eyes briefly. Like a man waiting for impact. "What now?" Brittany asked. Frank's smile faded. Not angry. Just serious. "Gary, tell her about the divorce disclosures." Gary immediately shook his head. "No." Frank nodded slowly. "I thought so." I looked between them. What divorce disclosures? Ethan sighed. Mom, the way he said it made my stomach drop. Not because I was afraid. Because I knew whatever came next wouldn't be good, Frank answered. During the divorce, certain financial information should have been reported. The room was silent again. Gary stared at the table. Frank. No. Frank's voice remained calm. You've had months. Months. I looked at Gary. Then I remembered something. Several strange arguments during the divorce. Several confusing explanations. Several times his attorney seemed oddly nervous. Pieces started fitting together. Not all of them. Enough, Frank continued carefully. As I understand it, attorneys are currently reviewing several issues. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The implication landed perfectly. Brittany looked horrified. Are you in legal trouble? Gary didn't answer. Gary, nothing. Then she laughed. A short, disbelieving laugh. Oh my God. Nobody spoke. She stood up. Actually stood up. You told me the divorce was simple. Still nothing. You told me everything was finalized. Silence. You told me she got nothing. Now people weren't even pretending not to watch. This was better than television. Gary finally snapped. Sit down. Wrong move. Very wrong move. Brittany stared at him, then shook her head. No. The confidence she'd shown all evening suddenly turned against him. You said the lake house was yours. Silence. You said your investments were yours. Silence. You said, enough. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. Because the story he'd been telling everyone was falling apart right in front of them. Piece by piece. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I mostly felt tired. 23 years. 23 years with a man I apparently didn't know as well as I thought. Frank looked at me, then nodded slightly, as if to say the next part was mine. I stood. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just calmly. And for the first time all night I spoke directly to Gary. You spent months convincing people I was a failure. He looked away. You wanted everyone to believe I couldn't survive without you. Still no response. I nodded. Maybe I believed that for a while. The honesty surprised even me. But here's what I learned. Now he looked up. I met his eyes. Steady. Confident. Done being afraid. You spent so much time trying to make me look small that you never noticed who you were becoming. The room stayed silent. You thought success was making somebody else feel worthless. I shook my head, but that was never success. Nobody applauded. Not yet. They were listening. And the night still wasn't over. For a few seconds after I finished speaking, nobody moved. The entire restaurant seemed frozen. Gary stared at me. Not with anger. Not with the smug confidence he'd carried in earlier that night. Just shock. Pure shock. I think that was the moment he finally realized something. The version of me he'd been talking about for months no longer existed. The woman who spent years smoothing over his mistakes, making excuses for his behavior and protecting his image was gone. And she wasn't coming back. Brittany looked from me to Frank, then to Ethan. Finally, she laughed again. But this time it wasn't the confident laugh from earlier. It sounded embarrassed. Almost desperate. So let me get this straight. Nobody answered. She pointed at me. She's an owner. Frank nodded. Yes. She pointed at Ethan. He controls part of the business, too. Yes. Then she pointed at Gary. And you knew. Gary looked down. That was all the answer she needed. The expression on her face changed immediately. I watched realization spread across it. Not just realization. Calculation. The kind people do when they're suddenly questioning everything they've been told. She grabbed her purse. Gary finally looked up. Brittany. No. Brittany, sit down. No. The restaurant had become so quiet that every word echoed. She shook her head. You made me look like an idiot. Gary rubbed his forehead. Can we discuss this later? Oh, now you want privacy. Several customers exchanged looks. Even Karen had stopped pretending to organize menus. Brittany laughed again. You spent all night humiliating your ex-wife. Nobody disagreed. You brought me here for that. Still nobody disagreed. And now I find out you've been lying to me? Gary opened his mouth, then closed it. There wasn't much left to say. Brittany looked at me. For the first time all evening, there wasn't any arrogance in her expression. Just awkwardness, embarrassment, maybe even a little shame. She stopped. Started again. I didn't know. I believed her. That surprised me. But I did. Because people like Gary rarely lie to only one person. They usually lie to everyone, including themselves. I nodded. It's okay. And strangely enough it was. The anger I'd carried all evening was fading. Not because Gary deserved forgiveness, because I was tired of carrying it. Brittany glanced at Gary one last time, then headed toward the door. The entire restaurant watched her leave. The front door opened. Cold autumn air drifted inside. Then she was gone. Just like that. Gary sat alone. For the first time all night. The image struck me harder than I expected. Because months earlier that had been me, sitting alone, trying to understand what happened to my life, trying to understand why someone I'd trusted had become a stranger. Frank eventually broke the silence. Well? A few customers chuckled, then a few more. The tension that had gripped the room finally loosened. People returned to conversations. Servers resumed carrying food. The restaurant slowly came back to life. Frank patted Gary on the shoulder. Not kindly, not cruelly, just firmly. Good luck. Then he walked away. Ethan followed him. I remained standing. Gary looked up at me. For a second I almost saw the man I'd married. The younger version. The one who used to make me laugh. The one who helped paint our first apartment. The one who sat beside me in hospital waiting rooms. The one who held our son when he was born. Then the moment passed. Because people aren't defined by who they used to be. They're defined by who they choose to become. Gary sighed. You enjoying this? The question surprised me. I thought about it honestly. Then I answered. No. He frowned. No. I shook my head. I would have preferred none of this happened. And that was the truth. If someone had given me a choice 6 months earlier, I would have chosen a peaceful divorce. A respectful ending. A little dignity for everyone. But life doesn't always offer those choices. Sometimes people create their own disasters, then blame everyone else when the consequences arrive. Gary looked exhausted. Older somehow. Not physically. Emotionally. Like years had caught up with him in a single evening. I felt sorry for him. Not enough to forget what he'd done. Not enough to excuse it. But enough to recognize that bitterness had already become its own punishment. I picked up the check folder from the table. Good night, Gary. Then I walked away. He didn't stop me. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. And honestly, that was fine. Some conversations arrived too late to matter. 3 weeks later, life looked very different. Not perfect. Just better. Several former friends reached out. A few apologized. Some admitted they'd believed Gary's version of events. Others simply said they missed me. I accepted the apologies that felt sincere. Ignored the ones that didn't. The restaurant continued operating exactly as before. Most customers never knew anything had happened. And that was how I preferred it. Despite everything Frank had revealed, I kept working my regular shifts. That confused some people, especially after word spread about the ownership situation. One customer finally asked me why. I smiled. Because I like it here. And I did. I liked the people. I liked the routine. I liked seeing familiar faces every week. After a lifetime of taking care of others, there was something comforting about simple work done honestly. A month later, Ethan moved back to Cedar Rapids. Not permanently, but close enough. We started having breakfast together every Sunday morning at a little diner near Ellis Boulevard. Nothing fancy. Coffee, eggs, conversation. The kind of ordinary moments that become precious after difficult years. One cold November evening, I stood outside Riverside Grill after closing. The Cedar River reflected the city lights. A few leaves drifted across the parking lot. Inside, Ethan and Karen were finishing up paperwork. For the first time in a very long time, I felt peaceful. Not victorious. Not triumphant. Peaceful. There's a difference. Looking back now, the biggest surprise wasn't discovering what Gary had hidden. It wasn't the public humiliation he suffered. And it wasn't the ownership stake I never knew I had. The biggest surprise was realizing I could rebuild a life I genuinely enjoyed. One day at a time. One shift at a time. One choice at a time. If there's anything this experience taught me, it's that some people spend years trying to convince others of their value. But real worth doesn't come from what someone says about you. It comes from how you live when nobody is watching. And sometimes the strongest response to being underestimated isn't revenge at all. It's simply refusing to stay broken. If this story reminded you of a time when you had to start over, I hope you'll remember that new chapters can begin at any age. And if you've rebuilt your life after disappointment, I'd love to know what helped you keep going.